Okay, so we're going to start with chapter 14, which covers a lot of material actually. It covers the digestive system, nutrition, as well as metabolism. So we'll start off with the nuts and bolts of our digestive system. You'll also be reviewing this in lab, so you'll get to look at models and possibly do some dissections associated with the digestive system. The system itself is actually a tube called the GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract. It's about 5 to 7 meters long. Sometimes it's also referred to as the alimentary canal. It contains food, and from time to time, or rather from the time that food is brought into the mouth until it's broken down and digested and absorbed or eliminated from the body. The digestive system itself is composed of our digestive organs, which is what the food actually passes through, and then there's some accessory digestive organs which have some important secretions to aid in digestion, but the food doesn't actually pass through them themselves. So our digestive organs, this is where the food actually passes. This would be the mouth, the pharynx, which is the fancy word for throat, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine. The accessory structures, these are the guys that have special secretions to aid in digestion, include the salivary glands, the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. So here you can see a nice overview of our digestive system organs inside the mouth, which is also known as the oral cavity. This is, of course, where the food is chewed. The mouth, as we know, contains teeth to help mechanically break down our food by chewing it up. The tongue is going to help move that food around to get the food to the teeth as well as to the back of the throat. The tongue also has special taste receptors for sensing all of the various chemicals in your food. The salivary glands, which are towards the back of the throat, some of them are underneath of your tongue, some of them are towards the back of your mouth, behind your upper teeth. They secrete saliva, of course. The purpose of saliva is to lubricate the food, and it also begins the process of chemical digestion using a special enzyme called salivary amylase, which breaks down carbohydrate molecules. From there, the food will pass into the pharynx and the esophagus, which are basically muscular tubes which will propel that food from the mouth into the stomach. The stomach is a muscular chamber with lots of muscles going in different directions to allow for this kind of churning and mixing of the food. There's a lot of enzymes and acids within our stomach itself to help aid in the breakdown of mostly proteins. The contractions of the stomach muscles are going to mechanically mix the food, and then there's some secretions, as I mentioned, like hydrochloric acid, pepsin, which is a protein digesting enzyme, and lipase, which is a lipid digesting enzyme, which will help chemically break down those food molecules. There's intrinsic factor secretion, which is going to assist in the absorption of vitamin B12 at this location as well. There's also some absorption of water and ions, some fatty acids, and certain drugs such as alcohol, aspirin, ibuprofen. Those are all absorbed directly through the stomach, which is why when you are drinking alcohol, it affects you very, very quickly because it's being absorbed directly from your stomach. There's also your stomach also plays a role in controlling the rate of food expulsion into the small intestine. It's a process called gastric emptying, and that's controlled by a small muscle here at the end of our stomach, at the bottom of the stomach. It's called the pyloric sphincter. This guy kind of opens and closes just like a sphincter muscle, just like a round muscle would, spurting out some of those food particles into the duodenum, the first segment of the small intestine, for further chemical breakdown. Let's talk about that small intestine. You can see the microscopic image of it here. The whole purpose of the small intestine is absorption. It's absorbing sugars, lipids, proteins, water, ions, vitamins. It's also going to secrete special hormones to act and help with other digestive organs. Some of the accessory structures are tied in tightly with that first segment. You can see it here. The first segment of our small intestine, the stomach has been removed. The stomach would be right here on this diagram. You can see the liver, you can see the pancreas, the gallbladder, and then this is that first segment called the duodenum or duodenum, depending on how you would like to pronounce it. That's the first segment of the small intestine. So the purpose of the liver is to receive, metabolize, as well as to store nutrients that have been absorbed from the small intestine. It also secretes bile, which can help break down large lipid globules, large fat globules. The gallbladder itself is going to store the bile, which has been secreted by the liver. So in other words, if your liver is overproducing bile, it will be stored in the gallbladder. The pancreas itself, which is located behind the stomach, which is why the stomach has been removed from this image, the pancreas secretes special enzymes as well as sodium bicarbonate to help break down the food into amino acids, into the smaller lipids like fatty acids, as well as into simple carbohydrates. Finally, the last stop on the tour of the digestive system is the large intestine, which functions in mostly reabsorbing the water from the food that has been digested. It also helps in reabsorbing some ions and vitamins, but the big guy is water. That is what's reabsorbed from our large intestines. There's also special resident bacteria that live within your large intestine. They help to break down any remaining carbohydrates and protein products. The chyme, which is what the food is now called, will eventually become a more solid structure, which we call feces, right? And that, of course, gets expelled via the anal canal. So let's talk about some functions of our digestive system. First, we start with ingestion, which is when you actually put the food into your mouth. Then there's going to be some secretion releasing water, acids, buffers, enzymes, etc. All of those things are being kind of dumped into the lumen of our digestive tract, into the opening of our digestive tract to help with some of that chemical digestion. There's also a mixing that takes place. There's churning of the food to prepare it for chemical breakdown, as well as the chemical breakdown for food with the enzymes. And then there's propulsion, where the digestive system will kind of squeeze and contract those smooth muscle layers to push the food through to the next stop on the tour, so to speak. Digestion includes the mechanical as well as the chemical breakdown of food. So, for instance, the chewing that occurs in the mouth would be mechanical. The chemical breakdown would be mixing all of the enzymes with the molecules in our food to get them to break down into smaller molecules. And then absorption, which is passing those digestive products from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood and into the lymph. And then defecation, which of course is eliminating the feces or the leftover waste products from the GI tract. The peritoneum is a special membrane that covers our abdominal organs. We mentioned this before, way back in chapter 3, I believe. It contains large folds to bind the organs to each other. It contains a structure called the greater omentum, which is also sometimes known as the fatty apron. This is a huge, literal fatty apron that drapes over the intestines. Some people have more of this greater omentum than others. This is where lots of body fat likes to accumulate other than the subcutaneous layer. The greater omentum is there for protection as well. Then you have the mesenteries, which is binding the small intestine to the abdominal wall as well as the large intestine to the abdominal wall, the parts of the stomach and parts of the liver to the abdominal wall so that everything stays in place. They're called the mesenteries. Here you can see what I was mentioning, that greater omentum or that fatty apron that literally drapes across all of our intestines, and that's for protection. And when you lift it up, you can see all of the mesenteries in there. If you were to literally pick up this intestine and try to pull it out, it would be stuck to, via this mesentery, to all of the other parts of the intestine. So it's kind of like a spider web meshwork of tissue in there. The intestines aren't just lying in there like worms. They are, in fact, all connected to each other via the mesentery. So the gastrointestinal tract itself, the entire tube, has 4 layers to it. So the innermost layer is called the mucosa. The 2 middle layers are called the submucosa and the muscularis. And then the outermost layer is called the serosa. So if you had a small intestine in front of you, what you would be looking at, assuming that it wasn't cut open, is the serosa. If you were to cut that small intestine open and look at the inner lumen, or the part where the food would actually pass, that's the mucosa. So the functions of these components, ultimately there's epithelial tissue to help absorb the food. there's connective tissue for support, and then there's muscle tissue to help contract and propel the food through the gastrointestinal tract. Here you can see what I was referring to. If this, for instance, was the small intestine, which I think it might be actually, this outer layer, this outer covering is the serosa. It's made of connective tissue as well as epithelium. Remember, epithelia are all of our coverings and linings. The serosa secretes a watery fluid to help lubricate the GI tract, allowing it to slide against any other organs. Just below the serosa is a layer called the submucosa, and you can see, actually in this image it appears, we'll stick with what the image shows us. Sorry for the mix-up there. Just below the serosa is the muscularis layer. The muscularis layer is a very thick double layer of muscle tissue. It's smooth muscle. Parts of the GI tract, though, are skeletal muscle, but for the most part, we're looking at smooth muscle tissue here. There's an inner layer of circular muscle and an outer layer of longitudinal muscle, and you can kind of see that, a circular muscle and a longitudinal muscle, and these two layers are going to contract in different ways to either narrow or constrict the lumen, as well as to push and propel food through the lumen. Just below this muscularis layer is a layer called the submucosa. The submucosa is a connective tissue layer that's going to bind the mucosa, which is that innermost layer, to the rest of the GI tract structure itself, in other words, to the muscularis. There's a neuronal network, which in this case would be the enteric nervous system, the ENS, because we're talking about our gastrointestinal tract, the autonomic nervous system as well, all going to control our GI tract. There's also blood and lymphatic vessels within this area to absorb food molecules, and glands in the submucosa are going to help secrete substances into the GI tract lumen. The innermost layer of our GI tract is the mucosa. So this is that inner lining. It's made of epithelial tissue to help absorb substances. There is a lamina propria just below. Find my mouse again. There we go. Just below, this is the epithelial tissue, mostly stratified squamous. Below that, you have your lamina propria, your connective tissue. There is another layer of muscularis tissue. This is called the muscularis mucosa. This is going to create folds to help increase the absorptive surface area of the inside of our GI tract. There's also special lymphatic nodules within this mucosal layer to help gobble up any pathogens that may be trying to invade. So let's talk briefly about the enteric nervous system. We mentioned it before when we were talking about the nervous system. The enteric nervous system is kind of like the brain within our gut. It's going to coordinate movements and secretions of our digestive tract. There's special neurons within that submucosa that control the secretions of organs within the GI tract. So we're talking about the special glands associated with our intestines, as well as some of our pancreatic and stomach secretions. The neurons within that muscularis layer are also going to control the frequency and strength of the contraction. So they're going to control the propulsion of food through the GI tract as well. Ultimately, that enteric nervous system is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So let's talk about the events of digestion in the mouth. Of course, ingestion is the very beginning of the digestive process, actually bringing the food into the mouth. Then you have the event called mastication. Next time you're at the dinner table, you can laugh at your brother or sister or husband or wife and say, "Ha ha, I see you masticating." I don't know, I think it's kind of a funny word. Anyways, it's the fancy word for chewing. It's done by the jaw muscle, as you may recall, right, the masseter muscle, as well as the teeth, doing the mechanical breakdown of food, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces. That's going to increase the surface area on the food so that various chemicals like enzymes can get into those broken up pieces and begin the process of chemical digestion. The teeth are shaped differently to serve different functions. There's tearing teeth, there's cutting teeth, there's grinding teeth. And then the salivary glands ultimately secrete the saliva, which is going to help lubricate and moisten the food, as well as has antibacterial properties to kill bacteria, and it has a special enzyme called salivary amylase to begin the process of starch digestion. The movement of the tongue against the teeth is going to create a little ball of food called a bolus. It's basically a soft, rounded, flexible mass of food that we don't like to think about, but it's in there as we're chewing, and it gets swallowed eventually. Here you can see some of the structures of our mouth. Maybe you have never really taken a minute to think about all of these structures, but you have the front 4 teeth on the top and bottom are called incisors. They're really there as our cutting teeth. They're there to help rip and tear and shear food. Think about when you bite into a sandwich, you're biting with these very scissor-like incisors. Just behind your teeth is a hard or bony palate forming the roof of your mouth. There's my mouth. Forming the roof of your mouth. Behind that is the soft palate. It's more muscular. This is going to form the rest of the roof of your mouth. And then in the back, we call it the hanging ball thing, but it's actually known as the uvula. The uvula kind of acts as a springboard or backboard so that when food's being chewed up and kind of pushed around the mouth, that food can bounce off that uvula and doesn't go down the throat prematurely. Sorry about that. Let's go back to teeth. We mentioned the incisors. Next to your incisors are your cuspids, also known as your canine teeth. These teeth are also there for tearing food. They have a sharp point on them, again, for that tearing and ripping sensation that sometimes you need when you're chewing something very tough. Next to your canine teeth, or next to your cuspids, you have your premolars. Your premolars are there to crush and grind food, just like your molars are, and you can see them over here. They have a very large, it's called the occlusal surface. They have a very large occlusal surface for grinding food. You also have your gums, which cover the sockets of our teeth to help anchor our teeth in place, and then of course the tongue, which is going to manipulate the food and allow for the sense of taste. The tongue is actually attached to a structure called the lingual frenulum. This is going to limit movement of the tongue posteriorly. So in other words, you can only move your tongue around so much in your mouth because it's attached by that lingual frenulum. You see these 2 little dots down there? Those are actually the ducts for your sublingual salivary glands, which secrete just underneath the tongue. Next time your mouth is watering, pay attention to where those secretions are coming from. You'll note that some of them are coming from under your tongue. So here you can see those salivary glands that I was just mentioning. You have the sublingual salivary glands and the submandibular salivary glands, as well as the parotid salivary glands. The parotid salivary glands secrete up behind the molars on the top set of teeth. And those are your 3 salivary glands. Interestingly enough, each set of salivary glands, because you're bilaterally symmetrical, so you'll have these on the right and left sides, each set has a different role. So each set of salivary glands, sorry I lost my train of thought there, secretes a slightly different type of saliva to aid with the various types of digestion that have to form. Overall, they all contain the 3 different components. Of course, water, which is the majority, but there's also salivary amylase, which is going to begin the digestion of starch. There's also mucus there to help lubricate food, and an enzyme called lysozyme that helps kill bacteria. Again, each of our glands has a slightly different concentration of those 3 components, but in general, they all have some of those components inside of them. Let's talk about the structure of teeth. The part that you can see, the part that's above the gum line, is called the crown. The part within the gums is called the neck, and then the part that dips into the bone, here you can see the bone, maybe the mandible, maybe the maxilla, depending if this is upper or lower teeth, that's called the root. So the crown is made of a hard substance called enamel, which is made of mostly calcium salts. This is going to protect our teeth from wearing away. There's also a calcified connective tissue called dentin. That's the majority of our tooth. The root, as well as parts of the neck, are made of something called a pulp cavity, which is kind of a hollowed out chamber containing the nerves and blood vessels. The root canal is the tube leading from the pulp cavity down and out the bottom of the root, where all of the blood vessels and nerves will remain connected. There's special ligaments. As you can see, there's lots and lots of them holding our tooth in place. They're called the periodontal ligaments. They help to anchor the tooth into the underlying bone. This animation here goes through the process of chewing or mastication. This enzyme here goes through the process of chemical digestion and enzymes. This animation here goes through the process of lipid digestion in the mouth. Now let's leave the mouth with a big gulp and talk about swallowing. The technical term for swallowing is deglutition. There's 3 stages. This is when your tongue first moves the bolus to the back of the mouth. That's a voluntary stage. You choose when your food's going to be swallowed, and your tongue pushes that bolus or that soft wad of food back. After that, it's all involuntary. The pharyngeal stage is when peristalsis takes over. This is going to be an alternating series of contractions of the muscular layers to help move the food through. Then the esophageal stage, as that peristalsis moves the bolus towards the stomach. Again, that's all involuntary except for the fact that your tongue pushes the food back. Here you can see the voluntary stage, the bolus of food, tongue's going to push it back. There you can see the tongue elevated in the back of the throat, the pharyngeal phase. You don't have to think about it anymore. Your body's automatically going to push that food down along with the assistance of gravity. Notice the epiglottis here is going to close over the trachea. See how it's open here? The epiglottis is a little flap in the very back of our throat in the larynx area. It's going to close so that food stays in the esophagus and does not go down into the lungs. Then you have the esophageal phase, where you have these contractions, squeezing that food down. Gravity helps a little, but your muscles are contracting. Your muscles are contracting with this phase. And then there's actually a small sphincter muscle here called the esophageal, or sometimes it's called the cardiac sphincter. This sphincter is going to release and allow that bolus to enter into the stomach. This is an animation of deglutition. We'll stop here for part 1.